If I asked you what the most important season in Minnesota Vikings history was, your answer might be different than mine. Let me explain on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, where we're always trying to learn something new. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to my hashtag everydayers for listening to this show every single day. I appreciate you all so very much. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Today on the show, we are continuing with this little history series that I am doing while I'm out of town, off the grid, unreachable, and completely unaware of whatever news may or may not be going down right now. So if there is a major news item that dropped this week and you're waiting to hear me talk about it, I will get to it when I am back home next week. But for now, we continue on. And we've sort of been doing this by the decade. We talked about the Vikings' origins in the 1960s, why they lost the Super Bowls in the 1970s, and on the last one, we talked about the 1980s and the Mike Lynn curse that set upon this team. And part of that curse was a deal that he struck with Max Winter, the then owner of the Vikings, about the construction of the Metrodome, and where he was going to get 10% of all luxury suite income, including income from non-Vikings events like Twins games or concerts. And that deal hamstrung the Vikings financially. I'm not talking about salary cap. I'm talking about the actual cash of the Vikings. So I'm going to build up to the most important game I think the Vikings have ever played. And it's not an NFC Championship game. It's not a major rivalry game. And it's not any of the Super Bowls. This is a pretty hot take, but hear me out. Because none of those games had the existential impact that this one had on the Minnesota Vikings. I am choosing the 1997 wildcard win in New York, a 23-22 late stage comeback that saved the Vikings as we know it. And I don't think you can say that about any other singular game. But to tell that story, I have to contextualize it with a lot of the broken business crap that started when Max Winter sold his shares of the Vikings. As with all things, as with all NFL teams, the ownership is never going to be monolithically one person. There's minor owners here and there. Someone has a stake in this team or that team, and therefore those people get something of a vote. They get a seat at the table, right? There's a majority owner, and that's the person. It's Ziggy Wilf right now, but much like the Vikings right now, Ziggy Wilf has some, Mark Wilf has some, Leonard Wilf has some. There are other minority owners that have little bits and pieces. And if those people decide to all work together, depending on how big the majority owner's majority is and how the deal is, those guys can make decisions that override the majority principal owner. A version of that was, I think with Ziggy Wilf, I believe the whole agreement is that everyone's kind of agreed in writing to not do that. And so Ziggy Wilf does have kind of final say in a bunch of these things. But the way it was before, with Erwin Jacobs and Carl Pohlad as the two major owners, Mike Lynn also had his stake. The estate of Ole Hogsrud was around, if you remember him from the 60s. There were all of these. It was like the circle of 10 or the team of 10, or I like to call them the 10-man oligarchy of the Vikings. The Jarl's table, if you will. It was these 10 businessmen. You don't need to know a lot about any singular one, but you have to know that it was a 10-headed monster that essentially bickered and fought over everything. They couldn't come to any decisions. Everything was mired in these sort of feckless compromises and gridlocked. And it was so hard to get them to work together on anything that the business side of the Vikings suffered greatly. And it was a bummer because during the 90s of football, and go listen to the documentary series that most of this research is from. Most of the reason I have all the books that I have behind me, if you're watching on YouTube, is because of research for the history doc. In fact, let me get a more 90s one out there. We call that a foreshadow if you are watching on YouTube. But the whole deal of it originally posted episode of the history doc that I did a couple of years ago, which is 7 hours of history content. You can find it at patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. Focuses a lot more on the players and what was going on the field. Jim McMahon and Warren Moon and going up into the 98 Randy Moss season and all that. I'm not going to talk about any of that today. Today, I want to focus in on the story of this 1997 wildcard game and why it held such existential stakes for the Vikings. But for context, the Vikings of the 90s during this time were pretty good. They were about as good as the Vikings are today. They were really good in the regular season. They couldn't win a playoff game. You might remember that about Denny Green. And ultimately, they weren't the kind of team that needs to like pack it up, ship, and move. So why? Well, it's because the business end of things was going really bad. The Metrodome wasn't making them enough money. The Mike Lynn deal was not helping at all. And ultimately, they were having trouble keeping things afloat. They needed an influx of cash really, really bad. And by the way, the Metrodome was decrepit. The Metrodome was it felt dated right off the bat. It didn't have, even when it opened in 1982 and it was the newest place and domes were all the rage and stuff like that, it didn't take long before it felt kind of cramped. And the sort of unfinished ceiling, and you could see like the air vents up top and the sort of fluorescent lighting. It was not, it was a bit of an eyesore. And from the outside, it was a bit of an eyesore. Not to mention people who had fought against the Metrodome, didn't want a stadium, didn't want to, their tax dollars going to a stadium because they weren't sports people, all kind of hated it. The Metrodome was it's like I have a lot of personal, really fond memories of going to the Metrodome, but you have to admit that it was kind of a dump, especially in the time when I was a kid, which was near the end of its life. And in the 90s, it was already seen as kind of a dump. They hosted a Super Bowl in 1992, or I think January 93. It was one of the Bills' lost Super Bowls, and it put on display just how kind of drab and like characterless the Metrodome was. It was all just like concrete and fluorescent lights. It looked like you were walking through a prison. So all this comes together to make the case that the Vikings really needed a new stadium, but it had not been long enough since the Metrodome had been constructed to like actually facilitate that. It wasn't reasonable to ask for a new stadium 10 years after they just finished a big, new, schwanky, expensive stadium. The other option then was to turn to relocation, Los Angeles. And one of the conversations that ended up happening that kind of didn't come out until later was how close they were to Birmingham. It hadn't been long since the USFL and the Birmingham Stallions put butts in seats. The Birmingham Stallions did very, very well for a USFL team. And they kind of did well again when they came back as the new USFL, which is now the UFL. They're still one of the better teams there. But like business-wise, they did well. They sold tickets. And it kind of proves that there was an appetite for football in Birmingham. Not unlike when a random exhibition in Minneapolis between the Cardinals and Eagles at the Met Stadium put butts in seats and they realized Minnesotans maybe want to watch football. Let's put a team there. So the Vikings genuinely had like serious conversations about moving to Birmingham when they were running out of money. The business was broken. They were hemorrhaging money. They had the only team that was bringing in less revenue. There were two teams bringing in less revenue, and they were the two expansion teams that had just opened in the Jacksonville Jaguars and Carolina Panthers. This was a study done in 1997. And the problem was you didn't have a principal owner. You didn't have a guy making that choice. So some people wanted to do that. Some people didn't want to do that. Some people didn't even want to talk about it. And the whole thing turned into this big bickering mess. Not to mention there was pressure from the NFL and Paul Tagliabue, who was relatively new as the commissioner. He had taken over in just 1989. And there was pressure to get every team with one principal owner. They wanted one person who definitely represented the team, that could go to all the meetings, that could answer if the league was upset with you about something, and that could sort of be held to account and represent the team in the grander National Football League stage. The Vikings didn't have that. They had a bunch of bickering dudes. Who's going to be that guy? And so they essentially pressured the Vikings. Someone's got to pick a main guy. But when you have 10 people who all want to be the main guy, nobody's going to give their vote to anybody else. And so it just led to this horrible grinding standstill with bad business practices, no hierarchy, no leadership, chaos. The front office, and I don't mean the GM front office because Denny Green was just doing that, but the actual business side of the Vikings was in total shambles. And what ends up happening to rescue them maybe doesn't happen if it weren't for that 1997 wildcard game. But that wasn't the only thing at stake in that game. That'll be next on Locked On Vikings. Today's episode of Locked On Vikings is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. At FanDuel, you can find anything you're looking for to bet on the upcoming Vikings season, from yardage totals, playoff props, and division odds, anything. For example, if you wanted, you could bet right now on the Vikings -106 to make the playoffs. That basically means that the betting market has no idea if the Vikings are going to make the playoffs or not. Their win total is set at 8.5 as well. People don't really know what's going to happen with the Vikings. However, over 8.5 wins is getting hammered. So the public seems to think that the Vikings have enough juice to at least get close to the playoffs. Agree, disagree, whatever it is, put a little money where your mouth is and go check out FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. So go find some heavy favorite baseball game or some super easy home run prop or something, some super easy strikeout prop or something with super short odds. And if you win, you can get 30-1 on that super likely bet. Otherwise, you can find whatever you feel good about. Put $5 on it, and if you win, $150 in bonus bets. That is at nowhere else but FanDuel. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Moving on with the Locked On Vikings podcast, I now would like to draw your attention to the man over my shoulder named Denny Green. He is... If you were listening, if you're listening on audio and you're not watching, that was the book I put back. It's Denny Green's autobiography. And the story of this autobiography is maybe the best way to tell the story of Denny Green and the Minnesota Vikings and how tense it always was. Denny Green was kind of not supposed to be here. There were two different times when the Vikings got very close to hiring Pete Carroll as their head coach. First was in 1984, when they ended up going with Les Steckel instead. Pete Carroll was one of the biggest frontrunners, although the real frontrunner that year was Jerry Burns. And of course, he's the guy that would take over later. But Pete Carroll was one of the options during that. And then after Jerry Burns retires in 1991, there's a head coaching search. The guy in charge of that search is the team president, Roger Hedrick. Roger Hedrick was not of the Bud Grant, Jim Finks tree that had essentially dominated the organization up until this point. There was a very strong status quo in Minnesota. That status quo was Bud Grant, Jim Finks, who joined together in 1967 and had some version of either them or guys that they handpicked to replace them ran the team afterwards. With Jim Finks, when he did leave and he left to go be GM of the Bears, and there's a little bit of a thing to that, maybe a story for another day. But when Jim Finks left in 1973, he had kind of already built the Vikings, so his impact on the Vikings still very much lasted. And then future GM decisions were like very Bud Grant. Bud Grant kind of took over. And that created this world of a combination GM head coach thing that Bud Grant was. And never really got replaced. Like Roger Hedrick was team president, but he wasn't really making the draft picks as much as Bud Grant was. So when Bud Grant retires and he gives that job to Les Steckel for a minute and then eventually gives it to Jerry Burns, it's kind of the same thing. Jerry Burns is like, judge, jury, and executioner. So when Jerry Burns is gone, we still have this sort of one mind controls all format in Minnesota, very much like what the Patriots had with Belichick. That is nowhere to be found in today's NFL, and probably for good reason, right? A little bit more collaboration, a little bit more specialization of people's responsibilities, probably good, right? But that meant that Roger Hedrick needed to find that guy, the head coach GM hybrid that was going to be the dude. And everyone thought it was going to be Pete Carroll. Pete Carroll wasn't with the Vikings still at this time. He was coaching with like the Jets as an assistant or something like that. But he still had very strong ties with the organization. The organization really respected him. And he was of the Bud Grant tree. He had been an assistant with Bud Grant for a long time. He made sense. And again, the status quo was there. The Bud Grant tree is what had produced the glory days of the Vikings. And the problem was trying to replace him with guys that were different from him in ways that seemed to hold the Vikings back. Les Steckel was different than him in a whole bunch of ways. Jerry Burns was different than him in that Jerry Burns was always more of a tactician, and Bud Grant was more of a leader of men kind of guy. Well, Pete Carroll is a great leader of men. We've seen that now for decades after this. He is absolutely the kind of guy that would come in, have that Bud Grant type impact, but then bring in like some tactician, some X's and O's guys to really run that part of the ball, that part of football. So it made a ton of sense, and everyone just kind of saw it as a foregone conclusion that Pete Carroll was going to be the dude. But Roger Hedrick saw it differently, and sort of privately and unbeknownst to a lot of the media people, Hedrick and some of the other people like in charge of this decision saw the franchise a little differently. They didn't see the Vikings as a team that had, run the league for 2 decades. Like some of the Vikings saw themselves. Hey, we went to all these Super Bowls. We're always good. We're always in it. We're stable. We're the crown jewel of we haven't won the actual championship, but we're always in it and we're the crown jewel. We're stable. We're good. They saw it as stagnant. They saw it as, coming off of the 80s. Coming off of 1976, it makes sense, right? You just went to 3 of 4 Super Bowls. You probably should stay the course a little bit. But coming off of the 80s and the chaos that decade brought from the 1984 year, the Herschel Walker trade, they were like in the depths of the Herschel Walker trade. They had just gotten out of, they just were getting first-round draft picks again. And so it felt like this perfect time for a totally fresh start. Thank you for your service, Bud Grant tree, but it's time to do something different because this hasn't really been effective in a decade. The best we did was 1987, and that was kind of fluky. So Roger Hedrick went totally off the beaten path, and he found a relatively young and unknown in NFL circles college coach in Denny Green. Denny Green was the coach at Northwestern, and he also coached at Stanford. He had turned the program of Northwestern around. That was kind of his claim to fame, that Northwestern was this total dreg, and Denny Green turned them into a respectable college football program. Before that, he coached with San Francisco, and he was part of the Bill Walsh tree. And that's, if you want to go get the coaching tree that's the crown jewel of the NFL, well, let's get rid of this Bud Grant tree that's sort of atrophied and go to the Bill Walsh tree that's been in the Super Bowl every damn year. So they went with Denny Green. Now, you're going to get a bunch of different perspectives on Denny Green, depending on who you ask. If you ask the papers, Denny Green is this dictator. He's this awful guy. If you listen to Denny Green, he is... The media is immediately hostile to him, and there were some of them they don't like that it's a black guy, and they don't like that it's an outsider. They're sentinels at the gate. You choose what you want to choose. For me, most of my research was the accounts of players. I felt like the players, the people who actually shed blood, sweat, and tears, were the perspective that I wanted to really most respect on this, and the players that played with him had universal respect for him. Look at the way Randy Moss spoke when Denny Green passed away. Look at the way Chris Carter spoke when Denny Green passed away. that to me is really impactful. I should mention that there was like a sexual harassment scandal with Denny Green that was part of this, that he sort of lumps in with like the big media smear job that they're doing with me. And because it was the 1990s, it went away a lot easier than it would today. But you can look into that on your own if you want to know more about it. But the way Denny Green describes it can only be characterized in the context of this book. This autobiography, which was published in the middle of the 1996 season. You got to understand, the Vikings were very much getting sick of being a first-round exit every year in the playoffs. Denny Green had not won a playoff game. This was his 5th season as the head coach, and he was careening toward that same wild card mediocrity. Meanwhile, the Green Bay Packers and Brett Favre were ascending to a greater level than the Vikings could ascend to, and it felt like the league was passing him by. The seat was very hot. So you got to imagine a hot seat coach in the middle of a up and down season. I forget the exact date, but I believe this was published in the middle of a 4-game losing streak, maybe on the bye, which came in the middle of that streak. That would drop them to 5-5, and they had to go to play at Oakland in this really important Monday Night Football game where everybody kind of rallied around him. And all of this stuff encompassed the sort of antagonistic relationship that Denny Green had with many members of ownership and the organization and the media. And to some, he was the hero that rescued their careers and maybe their lives. And by some, I mean guys like Chris Carter, guys like Robert Griffith that would have been totally overlooked, guys like John Randall that would have been totally overlooked. And then to others, he was the like monster tyrant of monster tyrants. A complicated figure, I guess, is what I will say. Now here comes the tell-all book. It's an autobiography. Most of the book is his life, his personal experiences growing up. You know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, being a black guy in the 50s and 60s and 70s and how it's different. And then being a black leadership figure in the 90s is different. And how he sort of learned to that sometimes all people need is a chance. And that really rings true when you see that he was the guy that gave Chris Carter a chance, or gave Randy Moss a chance, or gave Randall Cunningham a chance coming out of retirement in this disgraceful exit from the Philadelphia Eagles. And then in the end of the book, he goes nuclear. He spends a whole chapter absolutely lambasting the local media for being hostile to him and cold to him basically from the get-go, under the assumption that they all thought it was going to be Pete Carroll. And because I was hired, I was kind of this usurper and was treated as such, as though I illegitimately held the title. And like I did some coup and they don't respect me as their president, you know, that kind of thing. And in the end of it, there is a threat of a lawsuit that is this total scorched earth move. Just wild to imagine it on a hot seat coach's resume during the season. That'll be next on Locked On Vikings. Somewhere in the mid-90s, as Denny Green theorizes, and I don't really have a great counter theory, but you come up with your own. Let me know in the comments. Denny Green theorizes that a couple of Vikings owners, maybe it was somebody else, but his theory is that it was a couple of Vikings owners. Tell me your counter theory. Went to a freshly retired Lou Holtz in South Bend, Indiana, who had just left Notre Dame, and said, "Would you like to be head coach of the Vikings? You will get nowhere if you try to verify this." Lou Holtz wouldn't confirm it. Journalists couldn't get anywhere. Denny Green didn't know about it. Roger Hedrick didn't know about it. And maybe a conversation happened with someone where, you know, maybe it was just one of these in-passing things going, hey, you know, Denny Green's on the hot seat. If he does go, would you maybe put your hat in the ring? Or it could be, hey, we're going to oust him and you're going to come back, right? But either way, this was reported and became a huge media flurry right around that Monday Night Football Raiders game to snap the 4-game losing streak. This move was all Denny Green needed to concoct a plan to essentially hostile buy out the Vikings and become head coach, GM, and owner of the Vikings. That's what Denny Green wanted to do. And it gets kind of forgotten because what happens immediately after this is the 1998 season, and that rings so much more familiar in everybody's minds. But this was a wild time with Denny Green essentially trying to hostile buy out the 10-headed beast of ownership, where he had enough money himself as a head coach with a good salary to get and a long-time coach with a good salary to get a minority stake, get his seat at the table, and then to coalition build, much in the same way that Mike Lynn did, to sort of get a whole bunch of people all in one group to get their tiny little minority stakes together to become one bigger voting block and vote out the tyrants at the top. This is more or less what Mike Lynn did to Max Winter. And something that happens a lot in these sorts of shareholder type business arrangements. And honestly, it's kind of a party politics thing too, if you really want to go there, like an inter-party politics thing. It's a thing. And he lays out this whole plan in an autobiography that he sells in the middle of a season. Like, the people are reading this and then going, oh yeah, and like, by the way, the Vikings play Sunday. Like, and they're like trying to like cover how many touchdowns Jake Reed got. Like, it's insane. At the very end of the book, he has this plan to use the Lou Holtz thing to essentially bully and strong arm the Vikings into giving him this position and what he wants. And I am not kidding you. This is the legal documentation. You can hear it. Listen to that ASMR. The legal, like the actual like legal document he was planning to file. And it's like, it's prefaced with like, well, if I hypothetically wanted to do this, here's what I would file. And it's the whole document. It's the most threatening thing I've ever seen. And the copyright date on it is 1997. So you could say the seat is hot. The 96 season with that 4-game losing streak ended with no playoff berth. So we still haven't won a playoff game. We have to win a playoff game. The owners all hate the head coach. And by the way, they don't even really like being in Minnesota now. They're going to move if they don't get some kind of reason to think that this business asset is good. They're going to sell. At this point in 1997, this 10-headed beast, they all realize that their business investment is bad, and enough of them have agreed to sell to a principal owner, make the league happy, and it's just a matter of who they're going to sell to and if that person's going to move the Vikings. Well, look, you can sell a team and put in the sale agreement that you're not allowed to move that team. You can sort of take that worry out of the process. You say you cannot move the team if you're going to buy. But you can't do that if the asset sucks and can't win a playoff game and has terrible finances. It's not, you don't have that leverage. So this game needed to prove that the Vikings were a worthwhile asset. They needed to generate enough excitement to make a new buyer feel like, hey, with the right business decisions, if I'm a smart businessman, which of course I am because I have a lot of money, right? That's how it works. Then I can turn the franchise around. And that's exactly the context that we enter the 1997 wildcard game against the New York Giants. I won't go over every single detail of the game. There's a great article from Tyler Forness. Tyler, I couldn't find it. So if you're listening to this, message me the link and I'll put it in the show notes. But he loves this game for the reasons that I've been talking about, because it kind of saved the Vikings. It saved not just the Vikings and you know their head coaching regime at the time. It didn't just save the career of Randall Cunningham, which it also very much did. He had just come out of retirement for the 97 season and was in and out of the lineup that year. It saved the Minnesota Vikings as an entity. I think if they lose that game, if there isn't a super timely fumble and a super clutch touchdown from Randall Cunningham to Chris Carter, if that doesn't happen in the back of the end zone in the Meadowlands, I honestly think we're talking about the Los Angeles Vikings or the Birmingham Vikings. Maybe they would change the name. Maybe they would become, you know, the Birmingham. They would use the Birmingham Stallions branding or something like that, or maybe they'd be the Birmingham Iron, if you remember the AAF. I genuinely think this becomes a Minnesota North Stars situation where, as Minnesotans, we all hate it, you know. And I would probably hate them as much as I hate like the Lakers or the Dallas Stars. This is a pivotal moment. And so, yeah, it's the most important thing in football is to win the Super Bowl. But the most important thing in football is to survive. I don't know if the Seattle Supersonics fans need a title. If they got the Seattle Supersonics back, they'd probably be all right with it for a while. There's something powerful to that, but it's all because the Vikings were able to win a stupid wild card game. And by the way, they got shellacked the next week in San Francisco to, again, juggernaut 49ers, right? But it didn't matter because they had proved what needed to be proved. And what that did was show the Vikings as an exciting enough asset that you could actually get somebody to agree to buy them with the stipulation that they wouldn't move them. And the guy that bought them had no interest in moving them, not because of a loyalty to Minnesota. He was a San Antonio used car guy, but because he was so thrifty and moving the team is an expensive investment that he didn't think was worth it. That guy was Red McCombs. And while we hate Red McCombs now for his cheap and thrifty ways, in this moment with the Vikings way overextended and financially absolutely disastrous, that was exactly what the doctor ordered. And he brought excitement back to the fan base in a very purposeful way. Not to mention he joined the same time Randy Moss did, and the 98 season happened, and suddenly they were fun again. And the Vikings of like 98 to like 2004, the kind of Randy Moss, Dante Culpepper era, the Red McCombs era, was exciting. But McCombs only owned the team for 7 years. He basically flipped, like a used car salesman, man. He bought a lemon, flipped it around, made a profit, and got out of Dodge. It brought us the Wilfs, and very much still has as much impact today as you can attribute to the Wilfs. It's such a forgotten moment in Vikings history because of what came right after it, but it really shouldn't be. I will see you all next time. And as always, Skol.